So today we will be taking a look at validity and reliability in the research. So these are again very important terms and we always hear about them. We're like, oh, your research should always be valid, it should always be reliable. Why is it important? What exactly do we mean by valid and reliable research? In plain English, it's understandable, accurate and trustworthy, but is that what it really means in psychology? So there are broad definition of validity and reliability, then there is more specific types. So the basic assessment, so reliability, again, quite confusing, but here, so reliability refers to the consistency of your results, and validity refers to how well your research, your findings satisfy your objectives. So you wanted to find out this particular thing. Do your results actually help you fulfill that objective? And reliability is basically, are your results consistent? Or if test A and test 2 are same tests, will test A give different results than test B? We cannot have that, right? So first we will discover validity. So again, it refers to how accurately we measure what we set out or what we wanted to measure. Example, SAT test scores. Again, SAT test scores are basically measuring how well you would do in college or university. That's why so many universities require them. Now, how well an SAT test score measures or predicts your ability to do well in college is an example of how valid the SAT test is, right? Some people would argue not valid at all. Anyway, so there's internal validity, which is basically if you're doing an experiment, for example, how causal is DV towards the IV? So, did the IV really cause the changes in the DV? No? And it's similar to the general definition of validity that we're discussing here. Ecological, it's a very different term. Ecological is a type of external validity. It refers to how applicable your situation is to an external situation. So you're conducting this research. How applicable are the results of this research to a real life situation? So you conduct an experiment in a lab about how people help each other. How much, how are the results going to be similar if it was conducted in a real life subway station instead of a lab, right? So how much do the results apply to real life situations? That's what ecological validity refers to, right? Then there's temporal validity, which basically says that, if your research was conducted in a particular time period, will it still apply after a different time period when certain social and, you know, political rules have changed? When society has progressed so much, how reliable will it be? And that's what we'll see with our syllabus. Many of the research and many of the studies are conducted in 1960s, 70s, and how applicable would their findings, their general findings, be that they, of course, will see some changes in racial biases, etc., but would the essence, would the core be same? That's what temporal validity measures. Face validity is again simply we want to see if our tools or if our research is measuring content according to the layperson. So at first glance, is it really valid? That's why we say layperson because someone who isn't really involved in psychology, they're just taking a look at your research. To them, does it look valid? And typically, if your research doesn't have face validity, it might not have all these others either. There's concurrent validity, which basically means that your research gives similar scores as other research in the same subjects. So, does the the IELTS is an English proficiency test, right? And so is the TOEFL. So do they both test similarly, or is performing well on the IELTS test does not mean they're performing well on the TOEFL test? If they're testing the same thing, then score well on one means you should score well on the other, right? And that's concurrent. And then we have population validity, which basically means how well is your research going to apply on different populations. And this again is mainly dependent on your sample and your setting, as you can imagine. Then there's predictive validity is if your research is predicting significant differences among different groups. really. And the last few aren't really important in AS psychology, but they're good to know, and if you use these terms, you might get more of an edge against other students. So there are some factors that affect validity. You might notice that later on these factors also affect reliability because they're very similar things. I mean, these factors affect both validity and reliability, but in different ways because the terms themselves mean differently, right? So, again, it depends on which type you're talking about, but in general, how consistent you've been in your procedures. So, if you're using the similar type of procedure and standardization for all your participants, the type of task and the type of procedure. So how close it is to real life situations will probably help a lot with ecological validity and social desirability, basically all confounding variables which controls prevent against. So the more controls you have, the more likely it is that your research is going to be valid, and how generalizable your research is, what kind of sample you're using, because the type of sample again means the type of attributes that will affect your research, and the population validity is again also key. Next, we will discuss the second most important term, reliability. It broadly refers to how consistent or how standardized you've been in your procedure and how effectively you can replicate it, right? So you've performed a certain procedure, call it test A. Now, how easy is it to do test A again? And will doing test A again result in the same scores in result in the same scores as you did when you received test A for the first time, right? So how replicable your findings are, right? So doing test A twice and receiving vastly different results each time if you do it on different people, then it's not replicable at all. So if you do it with different people, will it achieve the same results? Is it easy to follow? This is what we look for here. So again, this is technically what reliability looks like, right? Consistent, it's typical, it's more quantitative, right? Everyone's in agreement with the same thing. Test A and test Z are similar in checking, alright? So there are again types, not as many as validity, but there are still certain types to it, alright? So again, all of which test different aspects of your research to be reliable, right? So there's retest reliability, which is pretty self-explanatory. Again, it measures the stability of a test over time. So I'm conducting this test in 2010, and then I'll conduct this test in, let's say, 2016. How similar are the results going to be? The more similar they are, obviously, the more retest reliability our measure has, right? Inter-rater slash inter-observer reliability. These are typically, so again, they're similar things but for different types of research. Inter-rater it typically refers to when two like scientists or two psychologists are grading a certain piece of data, right? And if they come up with similar conclusions, then you know they have inter-rater reliability. Again, like how we give the same piece of paper to grade like two different teachers, and if they come up with the same scores, then it's valid, it's reliable. I mean, again, it it gives us a degree of how consistently two different people can rate the same piece of data, right? Inter-observer is the same thing, except obviously it's for an observation. So observations happening, you have two different people observing the same situation, and how closely their findings or their data recordings match, the more inter-observer reliability you have, right? So then there's internal, which basically refers to the extent to which a measure or a test or whatever is consistent within itself. Now, a split half is a type of internal reliability. Again, it's not really part of AS, but it doesn't hurt to know, right? So split half basically, so if you have a test and you divide it in half, so you have a 60-mark paper, you divide it into 30-mark halves, how similar are the scores going to be at 2? So is your test an even level of difficulty throughout, or are the starting questions more difficult and at the end gets easier, right? The more consistent is it throughout, the more reliable it is, because some people might attempt those questions first, some people might attempt the first questions last, you know. So the more consistent it is in difficulty throughout the duration of its test, the better it is, right? Again. And these two were external. So the extent to which a measure varies or is similar to another. Now again, they become two factors that might affect reliability. You're going to see a lot of similarities, but as always, the key things to look for is if your research is consistent, it has a lot of controls, if it's standardized, then you're good to go. So main thing you need to look for is quantitative data, and the reason why I'll tell you is quantitative data is pretty objective, right? And the more objective you are, the less likely that there's going to be biases of, like, biases of how you think, and these things aren't going to affect muddle your results. So test A and test B, if they're both graded numerically, if they both have, for example, it's a maths test, it's more objective to grade on and the results will be similar each time compared to a literature or a history essay, right? That involves a bit more bias and it's more open-ended. So always look for quantitative data. Always look for a more representative sample. So if your sample has both males and females, that means the next time we try to do it in a different sample, for example, males and females, then we're likely to get a similar result. So if you did your research with just males, and if we try to do it on females the next time, then we'll have a few problems. Again, a lot of controls. Controls can look like forbidding your participants from eating or drinking certain stuff if we're going to be, injecting them with, for example, caffeine or any kind of vitamin injection, and making sure your participants are all in the same place, they're viewing a certain stimulus for the same amount of time, they're all viewing the same stimulus, right? And then there's standardization, which, as we mentioned, if they're giving a test in a room, it should be in the same room, same environment, similar noise levels, same materials, and obviously same content and test, or similar content at least. The environment should be same. What environment are they giving it in? Is it more natural? Is it more artificial? How controllable your environment is, and most importantly, operationalization. So the more objectively, the more clearly you have defined your variables, especially in an experiment, the more likely it is that another researcher is going to be able to replicate your research easily. And again, if you have an operationalized definition of what your stimulus is, for example, right, then you'll be able to do it to your other participants standardizedly and consistently as well, right? It's not about other researchers. Within your own research, you'll be able to be more consistent if you have operationalization. So that concludes the broad and specific terms of reliability and validity.